The man who had everything Blake Montgomery stood on the 62nd floor of Montgomery Tech Tower, watching the sunset paint Chicago's skyline in shades of amber and rose. At 34, he had built an empire from nothing. His software company was worth billions. His name appeared on magazine covers, and his word could make or break careers. He had penthouses in 3 cities, a collection of vintage cars, and more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. But standing there in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, staring at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows, Blake felt hollow. His dark hair was styled impeccably, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass, his gray eyes as cold as the marble floors beneath his feet. The world saw him as untouchable, unshakable, invincible. Only he knew the truth. He was empty inside, a shell of ambition and calculation, with nothing real to hold on to. That morning, his father had delivered an ultimatum in the boardroom. The old man's voice had been firm, unyielding, as cold as Blake himself had become over the years. Marry before your 35th birthday, or I transfer controlling shares to your cousin. The company stays in the family, but only with a married man at the helm. It's tradition, it's stability, it's non-negotiable. Blake had not flinched. He never did. But inside, something had twisted with resentment. He refused to be controlled, refused to bend to outdated traditions, and especially refused to pretend love existed when he knew better. Love was a fairy tale, people told themselves, to justify bad decisions. He had watched his parents' loveless marriage, had seen powerful men destroyed by their feelings, had learned early that emotions were weaknesses to be eliminated. So when the ivory envelope arrived at his desk that afternoon, embossed with gold lettering announcing an exclusive charity auction at the Grand Imperial Hotel, Blake decided to attend. Not because he cared about charity, but because he needed to prove a point. Everything and everyone had a price, even a wife. The woman who had nothing left to lose crossed the city. In the modest apartment she shared with her 19-year-old brother Oliver, Grace Sullivan tied her hair back with trembling fingers. At 26, she had the kind of beauty that came from genuine kindness. Warm hazel eyes, soft brown hair that caught the light, a smile that could ease anyone's worry. She worked as a nurse at Chicago General Hospital, often taking double shifts, sometimes triple when Oliver's medical bills piled too high. Oliver had been diagnosed with leukemia 2 years ago. Right after their parents died in a house fire, Grace had become his guardian, his sister, his mother, his everything. She had sacrificed her dreams of becoming a doctor, dropped out of medical school, and poured every dollar, every moment, every piece of herself into keeping him alive. But yesterday, the doctor had sat her down with eyes full of sympathy she could not afford to accept. Grace, Oliver needs a bone marrow transplant within the next 3 months. The procedure, the hospital stay, the medications afterward, we're looking at $500,000. Without it, I'm afraid he won't make it past summer. Grace had nodded, thanked him, walked to the bathroom, and vomited from the weight of impossible hope. $500,000. She made $40,000 a year. She had $1,200 in savings. She had borrowed from everyone she knew, sold everything she owned, worked until her hands ached and her feet bled. And it still was not enough. It would never be enough. That evening, her coworker Jennifer had pulled her aside in the hospital break room, speaking in hushed tones about something that made Grace's stomach turn. There's this auction, she had explained. Rich men, powerful people, they bid on companions for charity events. It's all legitimate, just dinner, conversation, appearances. One night could earn you more than a year of nursing. I know someone who did it once. She paid off her student loans in one evening. Grace had wanted to refuse immediately. The idea of being offered up, of having strangers place value on her presence, felt degrading. But then she had walked past Oliver's hospital room and seen him sleeping. Pale and fragile, his young face already marked by too much pain. And she knew she would do anything. Pride meant nothing when weighed against her brother's life. She signed the contract with shaking hands, telling herself it was just one night. Just dinner. Just pretend for a few hours that she belonged in that world, then walk away with enough money to save Oliver. The night everything changed, The Grand Imperial Hotel glittered like a jewel box. Crystal chandeliers hung from gilded ceilings, casting rainbow light across marble floors. Grace stood backstage in a simple cream-colored dress. Borrowed from Jennifer, her heart pounding so hard she thought others might hear it. Around her, other women prepared with practiced ease, adjusting makeup, rehearsing smiles, radiating confidence she could not fake. When her name was called, Grace forced herself to walk onto the small stage. The spotlight hit her eyes, momentarily blinding her. She could feel hundreds of gazes appraising her, measuring her worth. Shame burned through her veins even as she stood tall. The auction host spoke in smooth, practiced tones. Grace Sullivan, 26, a dedicated nurse with a heart of gold, gentle presence, compassionate spirit. The bidding started at $5,000. Grace kept her eyes lowered, praying it would end quickly. 10,000, 20,000, 50,000. Each number felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, a voice cut through the noise. Deep, commanding, absolute. $500,000. The entire ballroom fell silent. Grace's head snapped up, her eyes searching through the crowd until they found him. A man in black, standing with the kind of stillness that commanded attention without asking for it. His face was carved from shadow and certainty. His gray eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. She did not know his name yet. But something in that moment, in the electricity between them, whispered that her life had just changed forever. The contract of convenience going once, going twice. The gavel struck. Sold to Mr. Blake Montgomery. Grace stood frozen as a staff member led her down from the stage. Her legs felt unsteady, her mind racing with questions she could not voice. Why would anyone pay that much? What did he expect? What had she just agreed to? Blake waited for her near the back exit, his expression unreadable. When she reached him, he extended his hand like they were closing a business deal. Miss Sullivan. His hand was warm, his grip firm but not crushing. Grace took it, feeling the contrast between his world and hers in that simple touch. Mr. Montgomery, she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. They stepped into the cool Chicago night. The city hummed around them, traffic flowing like rivers of light. But between Grace and Blake, there was only charged silence. He spoke first, his tone matter-of-fact, almost clinical. I have a proposition for you. Not just tonight. Something longer. Grace's heart skipped. What do you mean? Blake turned to face her fully, his gray eyes assessing. I need a wife. A real marriage on paper for 1 year. You would live in my home, attend events with me, play the role publicly. In return, I will cover all of your brother's medical expenses. Surgery, treatment, recovery, everything. Plus a monthly allowance for your living expenses. Grace stared at him, certain she had misheard. You want to marry me? A stranger? Blake's expression did not change. This isn't about romance or feelings. It's a transaction. I need to satisfy my father's requirements to maintain control of my company. You need money to save your brother. We can help each other. Grace's mind spun. It sounded insane. It was insane. Marrying a man she did not know, pretending to be something she was not, living a lie. But Oliver's face flashed in her mind, pale against white hospital sheets. The doctor's words echoed. 3 months. She looked up at Blake Montgomery, this cold, calculating man who was offering her a miracle wrapped in a contract. Why me? She asked quietly. You could have anyone, Blake hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Because you're not part of my world. You don't want my money or my name? That makes this clean. Simple Grace did not know if she believed him. But she knew this. She was out of options, out of time, out of hope. And sometimes desperation made choices for you. How long do I have to decide? She whispered 20-4 hours, Blake replied. Then he handed her a business card, turned, and walked toward a black car waiting at the curb. Grace watched him go, clutching the card like a lifeline she was not sure she wanted to grab. That night, sitting beside Oliver's hospital bed, listening to the steady beep of monitors that tracked his failing body, Grace made her choice. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number on the card. "I'll do it," she said when Blake answered. "1 year. For Oliver." "Nothing more." "Understood," came the reply. "I'll have my legal team send the contract tomorrow." The call ended. Grace set down her phone and took Oliver's hand, squeezing gently. "I'm going to save you," she whispered. "I promise." She did not know that the man she had just agreed to marry was about to become the most important person in her life. She did not know that behind his cold exterior was a heart that had forgotten how to feel until she walked onto that stage. She did not know that 1 year would not be nearly enough. All she knew was that she had just made a deal with a stranger, and there was no turning back. A home without warmth. The contract arrived the next morning, delivered by a courier in a sleek black suit. Grace sat at her small kitchen table, reading through page after page of legal language that felt more like a business merger than a marriage agreement. 1 year commitment. Separate bedrooms. Public appearances as required. No expectations of physical intimacy. Complete discretion. Full medical coverage for Oliver Sullivan, including all treatments, medications, and aftercare. Monthly stipend of $10,000 for Grace's personal expenses. Grace's hands trembled as she signed her name at the bottom. She felt like she was signing away a piece of herself. But Oliver was scheduled for surgery in 2 weeks, and the hospital had already confirmed Blake's payment. Her brother would live. That was all that mattered. Moving day came faster than she expected. Grace packed her belongings into 2 small suitcases. Everything she owned fitting easily into the trunk of the car Blake sent for her. As the driver pulled away from her apartment building, she watched her old life disappear in the rearview mirror. Wondering if she would recognize herself when she returned, Blake's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the Montgomery Tower. When the elevator doors opened directly into his home, Grace stepped into a world that felt more like a museum than a place where people actually lived. Everything was white, gray, or black. Glass, steel, and marble. Not a single photograph, not a splash of color, not a hint of warmth anywhere. Blake stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his hands in his pockets, silhouetted against the Chicago skyline. He turned when he heard her enter, his expression neutral. "Welcome. Your room is down the left hallway, second door. The staff can help you settle in." Grace clutched her suitcase handle tighter. "Thank you." Her voice sounded small in the vast space. Blake nodded once, then returned his attention to the windows. That was it. No conversation, no welcome, no attempt to make her comfortable. Grace wheeled her suitcase down the hallway, feeling more alone than she had in years. 2 strangers, under one roof, the first 2 weeks passed in awkward silence. Blake left for work before dawn and returned after dark. They rarely saw each other except in passing. When they did cross paths, their exchanges were polite and brief. "Good morning. How was your day?" "The weather's nice." Words that filled space without saying anything real. Grace spent most of her time at the hospital with Oliver, whose surgery had gone well. Watching her brother's color return, hearing him laugh again, seeing hope replace fear in his eyes, made every uncomfortable moment in Blake's cold penthouse worth it. She would endure anything for this. But living in Blake's world felt like living in a beautiful cage. The penthouse was immaculate because a cleaning staff came daily. Meals appeared in the refrigerator, prepared by a private chef. Grace's clothes were laundered and pressed by people she never saw. Everything was done for her, and yet she felt useless, disconnected, like a ghost haunting someone else's life. One evening, unable to bear the sterile perfection any longer, Grace ventured into the massive kitchen. She had always found comfort in cooking, in creating something with her own hands. She opened cabinets, found ingredients, and began making soup. Nothing fancy, just chicken, vegetables, herbs, the kind of simple meal her mother used to make. She was humming softly, stirring the pot when Blake's voice startled her. "What are you doing?" Grace jumped, nearly dropping the ladle. She turned to find Blake standing in the doorway, his tie loosened, his usually perfect hair slightly disheveled. "Making soup," she said, recovering. "I thought maybe you hadn't eaten." Blake stared at her like she had done something completely incomprehensible. "The chef prepares meals. I know, Grace said quietly. But sometimes it's nice to make something yourself. Blake did not respond. He just stood there, watching her with an expression she could not read. Finally, he moved to the counter and sat on one of the high stools. Grace ladled soup into a bowl and placed it in front of him, along with a spoon and napkin. Blake looked at the simple meal, then at Grace, then back at the soup. He picked up the spoon and tasted it. It was good. Better than good. It tasted like home, like care, like something he had not experienced in so long he had forgotten it existed. "Thank you," he said quietly. Grace smiled, a small, genuine smile that made something shift in Blake's chest. "You're welcome." That night marked a change. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but real. Blake found himself coming home earlier, timing his arrival for when Grace might be in the kitchen. Grace started cooking more often, always making enough for two. They began eating together, sitting at the counter. The conversations growing longer, less guarded. Seeing each other, Grace learned that Blake took his coffee black with no sugar, that he worked 16-hour days because he did not know what else to do with his time, that he had built his company from a small startup in a garage, working 3 jobs to fund it, sleeping 4 hours a night for 5 years until it took off, that his father had never been proud, never been warm, and never been anything but demanding and distant. Blake learned that Grace sang when she thought no one was listening, that she read the same mystery novel every year because it reminded her of her mother, that she became a nurse because she wanted to help people the way no one had been able to help her parents, that she blamed herself for not saving them from the fire, even though she had been miles away at school when it happened. One Saturday afternoon, Grace was reading on the couch when Blake emerged from his office, looking exhausted. She glanced up. "When was the last time you took a day off?" Blake frowned. "I don't take days off." Grace set down her book. "That's not healthy." "I'm fine." "You look tired." "I am tired," Blake admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. Grace stood up. "Come with me where?" "You'll see." Against his better judgment, Blake followed. Grace led him out of the penthouse, down to the garage, insisted they take his car, but that she would choose where they went. Blake found himself driving to Lake Michigan. Following Grace's directions to a quiet stretch of beach she had discovered during her walks, they walked along the shore in silence, the wind pulling at their clothes, the sound of waves filling the space between them. Blake could not remember the last time he had simply walked without purpose, without destination, without agenda. "Why did you really bid on me that night?" Grace asked suddenly. Blake stopped walking. He looked out at the water, his jaw tightening. "To prove a point. That everything has a price. That people are just transactions." Grace turned to face him. "And do you still believe that?" Blake met her eyes. Those warm hazel eyes that had started appearing in his thoughts at odd moments during the day. He opened his mouth to say yes, to maintain the walls he had spent a lifetime building. But standing there with this woman who had brought warmth into his cold world without asking for anything in return, he found he could not lie. "I don't know anymore," he said quietly. When hearts betray logic as weeks turned into months, the distance between them dissolved. Blake found himself watching Grace when she thought he was not looking. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. The way she laughed, freely and fully, when Oliver told her silly jokes during hospital visits. The way she moved through his home, bringing life to spaces that had been dead for so long. Grace found herself noticing things too. The way Blake's eyes softened when he looked at her. The way he started leaving small gifts for her to find. A book she had mentioned wanting. Flowers in a vase on the kitchen counter. A donation made in her name to the hospital's children's wing. He never said anything about these gestures, never sought credit. But Grace saw them, felt them, and her heart responded against her will. One evening, Blake came home to find Grace crying in the kitchen. He froze, panic rising in his chest. "What happened? Is Oliver okay?" Grace looked up, wiping her tears quickly. "He's fine." "Better than fine?" "The doctor said he's in full remission. He's going to be okay." Blake exhaled in relief. "Then why are you crying?" "Because I'm happy," Grace said with a trembling smile. Because my brother is going to live. Because 6 months ago I thought I was going to lose him, and now he has his whole life ahead of him without thinking. Blake crossed the room and pulled Grace into his arms. She stiffened for just a moment, then melted into him, letting herself be held, letting herself take comfort in his strength. Blake rested his chin on top of her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, feeling her heart beat against his chest, and knew with absolute certainty that he was in trouble. He had fallen in love with his contract wife. The realization terrified him. Love was not part of the agreement. Love was not something he had planned for, prepared for, protected himself against. Love made him vulnerable, gave someone else the power to destroy him. But as he held Grace in his kitchen, feeling her tears soak into his shirt, Blake knew it was too late. She had already slipped past every defense, claimed every guarded piece of his heart, and he could not imagine his life without her. But he said nothing. The contract had 7 months remaining. Grace had never indicated she wanted anything more than the arrangement they had agreed to. She was here for Oliver, for the medical care, for the security, not for him. Telling her how he felt would only make things awkward, might make her feel obligated or uncomfortable. So Blake kept his feelings locked away, hidden behind the same walls he had always maintained. Even as those walls cracked a little more each day, the storm arrives. Blake's younger sister, Natalie Montgomery, had always been his closest family member. At 29, she was beautiful, ambitious, and fiercely protective of her brother. She worked as vice president of marketing at Montgomery Tech and lived in a penthouse 2 floors below Blake's. When Blake had announced his sudden marriage, Natalie had been shocked. Her brother, who had never dated anyone for more than a few weeks, who had sworn off relationships entirely, was suddenly married to a woman no one had ever heard of. Natalie's attempts to meet Grace had been politely deflected, which only increased her suspicion. Finally, Natalie showed up unannounced one Saturday morning. Grace answered the door in comfortable clothes, her hair in a messy bun, no makeup. Looking nothing like the gold diggers Natalie had expected. "You must be Natalie," Grace said with a genuine smile. "Blake has told me about you? Please, come in." Natalie stepped inside, her designer heels clicking on the marble floor, her eyes assessing everything. Over coffee, she asked pointed questions, probing for weakness, looking for evidence that Grace was using her brother. But Grace answered honestly. Spoke about Oliver's illness, about being a nurse, about missing her old life, even though she was grateful for Blake's help. Against her better judgment, Natalie found herself almost liking Grace. Almost. But the protective instinct ran deep. Blake was all she had. Their father was cold, their mother distant. Blake had raised Natalie after their parents divorced, had paid for her education, had given her a career. She would not let anyone hurt him. So Natalie hired a private investigator. She told herself it was just due diligence, just making sure Grace was who she claimed to be. The investigator reported back within a week. Grace Sullivan appeared clean. No criminal record, no suspicious financial activity, no hidden agenda, but there was someone of interest. A man named Trevor Walsh, Grace's childhood friend and former colleague from her time in medical school. The investigator provided photos. Trevor visiting Oliver in the hospital. Trevor and Grace having coffee at a cafe near the hospital. Trevor hugging Grace outside. The hospital entrance after a particularly difficult day with Oliver. Natalie stared at the photos. Alone, they were innocent. But arranged carefully with the right lighting, the right angles, they could tell a different story. A story of a woman keeping secrets, maintaining a relationship outside her marriage. Perhaps planning something more. Natalie's mind worked quickly. She had the photos digitally altered. Subtle changes. A softening of light to make the images look more intimate. Timestamps adjusted to make the meetings appear more frequent. She had a tech expert create a false text message thread. Fabricated messages that made it look like Grace was confiding in Trevor, complaining about Blake. Counting down the days until the contract ended, she packaged everything in an envelope and had it delivered to Blake's office with a note. "I'm sorry, big brother, but you need to see who she really is. I warned you, Natalie." Everything shatters. Blake received the envelope on a Thursday afternoon. He had been planning to leave work early, to surprise Grace with dinner reservations at the restaurant where they had shared their first real conversation weeks ago. He had been working up the courage to tell her how he felt, to ask if maybe, just maybe, when the contract ended, she might consider staying not because of the agreement, but because she wanted to. He opened the envelope. The photos spilled onto his desk. Grace in another man's arms. Grace smiling at someone who was not Blake. The text messages. Can't wait until this year is over. He suspects nothing. Just a few more months, and I'm free. Blake's world tilted. Every moment they had shared, every smile, every laugh, every time she had cooked for him or listened to him or made him feel like maybe he was worth caring about, it was all a lie. She had been playing him perfectly, biding her time, waiting for the contract to end so she could walk away with Oliver's medical bills paid and months of allowance in her bank account. He had been right all along. Everything had a price. Everyone was just playing angles. Love was not real. It was just another transaction, another manipulation, another way for people to use each other. Blake sat in his office as the sun set. The photos spread before him, his heart turning to ice again. He had let his guard down. He had been weak. He had believed. And he had been played for a fool when he finally came home that night. It was late, past midnight. Grace was asleep on the couch, a book open on her chest, waiting for him like she did most nights. Blake stood in the doorway looking at her. This woman who had made him believe in something beautiful and felt nothing but cold. Calculated fury, he dropped the envelope on the coffee table with a loud thump. Grace jerked awake, confused, disoriented. Blake? He said nothing, just pointed at the envelope. Grace, still foggy with sleep, opened it, pulled out the photos. Her face went pale. This is Trevor, she said immediately. He's my friend from medical school. He came to visit Oliver. Blake laughed. A harsh, bitter sound. Of course he is. Grace looked at the text messages, her eyes widening. These aren't real. I never sent these. I never said any of this. Convenient, Blake said coldly. Grace stood up, the papers scattering at her feet. Blake, please. This is fake. Someone created this. I don't know why or how, but I never you must think I'm incredibly stupid. Blake interrupted, his voice like shattered glass. Did you enjoy it? Watching me fall for you? Watching the cold, heartless CEO turn into someone pathetic enough to believe in fairy tales? I wasn't playing you, Grace said, her voice breaking. Whatever this is, whoever did this, it's not real. What we have is real. We have a contract, Blake corrected. One that ends in 7 months. Congratulations, Miss Sullivan. You played your part perfectly. Oliver gets his treatment. You get your money. I get reminded why I don't believe in love. Grace felt tears streaming down her face. I know what this looks like, but please believe me. Trevor is just a friend. He was supporting me through Oliver's illness. There's nothing between us. Then explain the messages, Blake demanded. I can't, Grace whispered, because I never sent them. Someone is lying to you. Blake looked at her. This woman he had loved, this woman he had opened his heart to. And he could not tell if she was telling the truth or giving an Oscar-worthy performance. And that uncertainty felt like another betrayal. The contract stipulated 1 year. Blake said quietly, each word precise and final. But there's a clause that allows either party to terminate early under certain circumstances. Breach of trust qualifies. I want you out by morning. Grace staggered backward as if he had struck her physically. Blake, please, don't do this. Let me prove it to you. Let me find out who did this. I don't care who did this, Blake said, though his voice wavered just slightly. I care that I was stupid enough to believe you were different. Leave, Grace. Take the money you've earned. Your brother's medical care will continue as agreed. But I don't want to see you again. Grace stood there, tears pouring down her face, her heart shattering into pieces she knew she could never put back together. She wanted to fight, to scream, to make him see the truth, but she saw the walls back in place, saw the ice in his eyes. Saw the man who had bid $500,000 just to prove everyone had a price. That man was back, and the Blake who had held her in the kitchen, who had walked with her by the lake, who had almost told her he loved her a dozen different ways, was gone. She walked to her room, packed her 2 small suitcases, left behind every dress, every gift, every piece of the life they had built together. At the door, she turned back one last time. Blake stood by the windows again, his back to her, his shoulders rigid. "I love you," Grace said quietly. "I don't care if you believe me. I don't care if you think I'm lying. But I love you, and I thought maybe you loved me too. I'm sorry I was wrong." She left. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like an ending. Blake stood alone in his penthouse. The silence rushed back in, filling every corner, suffocating him. He looked at the photos scattered on the floor, at the fabricated messages. And somewhere deep inside him, a small voice whispered that he had just made the worst mistake of his life. But he ignored it. He had learned his lesson. Again. When everything falls apart, Grace returned to her old apartment in a daze. The small space felt even smaller after months in Blake's penthouse, but at least it was hers. At least here, nothing was pretend. She set her suitcases down and sat on the edge of her bed, staring at nothing, feeling everything. She should have fought harder. Should have demanded he listen. Should have investigated the photos herself. Should have proven her innocence. But what good would it have done? Blake had looked at her with such cold certainty, such complete conviction that she had betrayed him. He had wanted to believe the worst because it confirmed what he had always thought, that love was not real, that people were just using each other, that he had been right to keep his heart locked away. Grace had loved him anyway. Despite the contract, despite the walls, despite knowing it was dangerous and foolish and would only end in pain, she had loved him, and it had not been enough. 3 days later, the call came from the hospital. "Grace, you need to come now," Oliver's doctor said. "There's been a complication." Grace's world stopped. What kind of complication? "Just come, please," Grace ran. Through the streets, into a cab, through the hospital corridors. She burst into Oliver's room and found her brother pale, struggling to breathe, machines beeping, urgent warnings. The doctors were already working, speaking in calm, clipped tones that medical professionals used when things were very, very bad. "What happened?" Grace demanded. "He was fine. He was in remission." Dr. Patterson pulled her aside. "There was an infection we missed. It spread quickly. Grace, his immune system is still compromised from the transplant. We're doing everything we can, but what? You should call anyone you want him to see." Grace felt the floor drop out from under her. No, this isn't happening." "You said he was better." "You said die, I'm sorry," the doctor said gently. "Sometimes these things happen, even when we do everything right." Grace sat beside Oliver's bed, holding his hand, watching him fight for every breath. He was unconscious, had been since the infection overwhelmed his system. She talked to him anyway. Told him about the books she had been reading, about the lake she had discovered, about how proud she was of him. She did not tell him about Blake, about the marriage that had ended before it truly began, about the love she had lost. Some pain was too raw to speak aloud. On the second day, Oliver woke briefly. "Gracie," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm here," Grace said, squeezing his hand. "I'm right here. Did it work? Did the marriage thing work? Am I going to be okay?" Grace forced a smile through her tears. "You're going to be fine. Everything worked out perfectly." "Good," Oliver said, his eyes drifting closed again. "You deserve to be happy, Gracie. Promise me you'll be happy." "I promise," Grace whispered. Oliver died that evening as the sun set. Peacefully, the doctors said, as if that made it hurt less. Grace held his hand as his heart stopped, as the machines flatlined. As the life left his body and she was suddenly, completely, unbearably alone, the disappearing act, Grace did not remember the funeral, did not remember the social worker who helped with the arrangements, the co-workers who attended, the condolence cards that arrived in the mail. She moved through it all like she was underwater, sound and sensation muffled. Everything distant and wrong. Blake's money had paid for everything. The burial, the service, the hospital bills that continued even after death. Grace should have been grateful. Instead, she felt nothing. Just empty, hollow. A shell walking through motions that meant nothing anymore. A week after the funeral, Grace packed a single backpack. She left no forwarding address, told no one where she was going, simply walked out of her apartment and kept walking. She bought a bus ticket to the first small town she had never heard of, a place called Willowbrook. 3 hours from Chicago, population 2,000, where no one knew her name or her story or her pain. She found a tiny efficiency apartment above a bookstore, paid 3 months' rent in cash, and disappeared into the kind of quiet that felt like drowning. The man who lost everything, Blake, threw himself into work. 18-hour days, 20-hour days, days that blurred together into an endless stream of meetings and deals and negotiations that meant nothing. He closed the biggest merger in his company's history and felt nothing. He appeared on the cover of 3 business magazines and did not care. He added another billion to his net worth and wondered why it felt so worthless at night. In his penthouse, he saw Grace everywhere. In the kitchen where she had made soup, on the couch where she had read, by the windows where they had watched the city lights together. Her absence was louder than her presence had ever been. He tried to convince himself he had done the right thing, that she had betrayed him, that the photos proved it. But late at night, when he could not sleep, when the silence pressed down on him like a weight, he remembered her face. The shock, the hurt, the desperate truth in her voice when she said she loved him, and he began to doubt. 2 months after Grace left, email arrived, anonymous. Subject line, "You need to see this." Blake almost deleted it, but something made him open it. Inside was a video file. Security footage from the hospital on the day Trevor had visited. Blake watched, his heart pounding. As the video showed Grace breaking down in the hallway, crying so hard she could barely stand. Showed Trevor, this supposed secret lover, approaching her with concern, asking what was wrong. Showed Grace explaining between sobs that she was terrified Oliver would not survive, that she felt like she was failing him, that she did not know how to keep going. Showed Trevor offering a hug, nothing more. Just a friend supporting a friend through an impossible moment. Then came the documents. The original photos, time-stamped and geotagged, showing clearly that the meetings had been innocent, brief, always in public, always about Oliver. Then the altered versions, showing exactly how someone had manipulated the lighting, changed the timestamps, made something innocent look sinister. Finally, the text messages, the real ones. Simple, friendly exchanges about Oliver's progress. And then the fabricated ones, with metadata showing they had been created in an editing program, complete with the name of the computer that had created them. Natalie's computer. Blake felt his world implode. He had destroyed the only real thing in his life over a lie. He had pushed away the only woman who had ever loved him for who he was, not what he could give her. He had proven himself to be exactly what he had always feared. Heartless, cold, incapable of seeing what was right in front of him. He did not hesitate. He left his office immediately, drove to Natalie's apartment, and confronted her. His sister tried to justify it, said she was protecting him, said Grace was not good enough for the Montgomery family. Blake listened to her excuses and felt nothing but disgust. "You're no longer welcome in my life," he said quietly. "You're no longer employed at my company." "I don't want to see you again, Blake, please," Natalie begged. "I was just trying to help." "You didn't help me," Blake said. "You destroyed me," he left. Quit his position as CEO effective immediately. Sold his shares in the company. Cut ties with his father, with the board, with everything that had defined him. What was the point of an empire when he had lost the only person who made him feel human? He began searching for Grace. Her apartment was empty, forwarding address none. Her former co-workers had not heard from her. She had vanished completely, and Blake did not blame her. Why would she want to be found by the man who had shattered her heart? But he could not stop looking. He hired investigators, followed every lead, drove through small towns asking if anyone had seen a young woman with hazel eyes and a sad smile. Most leads went nowhere, but one investigator reported a possible sighting in a town called Willowbrook. Blake drove there immediately. Found the efficiency apartment above the bookstore. Knocked on the door. No answer. He asked the bookstore owner if she knew the woman who lived upstairs. She does, the owner said. But she doesn't talk much. Just works at the diner down the street, reads a lot, keeps to herself. Blake waited. For hours. Then days. He rented a room at the town's only motel. Every morning he went to the diner. Sat in the back booth, waited, and on the third day, she appeared when words are not enough. Grace pushed through the diner door. Tying her apron, her hair pulled back, her face thinner than Blake remembered. She looked tired. So tired. Like someone who had stopped sleeping, stopped dreaming, stopped hoping. She glanced around the diner, her eyes passing over Blake without recognition. Then she stopped. Looked again. Her face went white. Blake stood slowly, his hand shaking. Grace. She said nothing, just stared at him like he was a ghost. Something impossible and unwanted appearing in the one place she had thought was safe. Please, Blake said, his voice raw. Please let me explain. Grace shook her head, backing toward the door. No, you need to leave. I know I don't deserve your time, Blake said quickly, desperately. I know I was wrong. I know what Natalie did. I know you were telling the truth, and I should have believed you. I know I destroyed everything good in my life because I was too scared to trust what we had. I know all of that, and I'm so sorry. Grace's hands trembled. She wrapped her arms around herself, protecting what little of her heart remained. You told me to leave. You didn't believe me? You thought I was using you. I was afraid, Blake admitted, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I was terrified because I loved you, and I had never loved anyone before, and I didn't know how to trust it. So when Natalie showed me those photos, grabbed onto them like a lifeline because it gave me an excuse to run before you could hurt me first. Grace looked at him. Really looked at him. Saw that he had lost weight, too. That his eyes were shadowed. That his carefully constructed armor had finally cracked wide open. Oliver died, she said quietly. Blake's knees buckled. He sank back onto the booth seat. When? 2 days after you told me to leave. There was an infection. They couldn't stop it. Grace, I'm so sorry. He was all I had, Grace continued, her voice hollow. I gave up everything for him. Medical school, my dreams, my entire life. I married a stranger for him, and he died anyway. And I realized it was all for nothing. It wasn't for nothing, Blake said softly. You loved him. You fought for him. You gave him 2 extra years he wouldn't have had without you. And what do I have now? Grace asked, tears finally spilling over. He's gone. You're gone. Everything is gone. Blake stood again, slowly crossed to where she stood. Grace did not move away. She just watched him, exhausted, broken, barely holding together. You asked me once if everything has a price, Blake said, and I told you it did. But I was wrong. What we had, that wasn't for sale. It wasn't a transaction. It was real. The realest thing I've ever had. And I threw it away because I was too damaged to recognize love when it was standing right in front of me. Grace closed her eyes. What do you want from me, Blake? Nothing, Blake said. I don't want anything from you. I just needed you to know the truth. That I was wrong. That you were right. That I love you. That I've loved you since the night you made soup in my kitchen, and I realized my whole life had been empty until you walked into it. Grace opened her eyes. She looked at this man, this billionaire who had given up everything, who had driven hours to find her, who was standing in a small-town diner with his heart in his hands, offering it to her with no guarantees. No contracts, no conditions. I don't know if I can do this again. Grace whispered, I don't know if I have anything left to give. You don't have to give me anything, Blake said. I'll take whatever you're willing to share. Even if it's just this conversation. Even if you tell me to leave and never come back, I'll accept it. Because you deserve to choose. You deserve to have someone who believes in you completely. And I'm so sorry I wasn't that person when you needed me to be. Grace stood there, torn between the pain of what he had done and the love that had never fully died. She thought about Oliver, about his last words. Promise me you'll be happy. Could she be happy again? With Blake? After everything? She did not know. But standing there, looking at the man who had broken her and who was now offering to spend the rest of his life trying to fix what he had shattered, Grace realized something. She was tired of being alone. Tired of protecting herself. Tired of letting fear make all her decisions. I need time, she said finally. Blake nodded. I'll wait. However long it takes. And he did wait. He rented the room at the motel indefinitely. Every morning, he came to the diner, sat in the same booth, ordered coffee and breakfast. Never pushed, never demanded, just quietly existed in her orbit. Showing her through action what words could not convey, he fixed the leaky pipe under her apartment sink, replaced the broken step on the bookstore staircase, planted flowers in the small garden behind the building. Small things. Simple things. Acts of care that asked for nothing in return. Weeks passed. Then months. Spring came to Willowbrook, painting the town in soft colors. Grace began teaching art classes at the community center, finding solace in helping others create beauty. Blake attended every class, sitting in the back, watching her come alive again as she guided children through watercolor landscapes and charcoal sketches. One afternoon, after class ended and the children had left, Grace approached Blake. Why are you really here? She asked. Because this is where you are, Blake said simply. And wherever you are is where I want to be. Grace sat beside him. I've been thinking about what you said, about love not being a transaction. Blake waited, barely breathing. I think you were right, Grace continued. I think what we had was real, and I think maybe it still is. Blake's heart stopped. What are you saying? I'm saying I forgive you, Grace said softly. I'm saying I understand why you did what you did. I'm saying I'm tired of being afraid, and I'm tired of being alone, and I miss you. I miss us. Blake reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. He took her hand, feeling her warmth, her realness, and felt something in his chest unlock. I love you, he said. Not because of a contract or an agreement or an obligation. Just because you're you. I love you too, Grace replied. And this time when she smiled, it reached her eyes. Beginning again, they did not rush. Grace kept her apartment. Blake kept his motel room. They dated properly this time, like normal people. Coffee at the local cafe. Walks through the town park. Movie nights where they argued playfully about plot holes. Long conversations where they talked about everything they had avoided before. Their fears, their dreams, their scars, their hopes. Blake told Grace about his childhood. About learning to value money over people because it was safer. About being terrified of becoming like his father. Grace told Blake about the guilt she carried over her parents' death. About the fear that she would lose everyone she loved. About learning to survive but forgetting how to live. 6 months after Blake found her in Willowbrook, he took Grace back to the lake in Chicago. The same beach where they had walked during their marriage. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Grace Sullivan, Blake said, taking her hands in his. I asked you once to marry me for a contract. For money and convenience and all the wrong reasons. But I'm asking you now, not as a CEO with an ultimatum, but as a man who loves you more than he knew was possible. Will you marry me again? For real this time. Forever this time. Grace looked at him, at this man who had traveled so far to find her, who had waited so patiently for her to heal, who had learned to love despite being taught all his life that love was weakness. Yes, she said, laughing through tears. Yes, I'll marry you. Blake kissed her there on the beach as the sun dipped below the horizon and the city lights began to sparkle across the water. And for the first time in both their lives, they felt complete. They got married 3 months later. A small ceremony in Willowbrook, with only a handful of guests. No fanfare, no press, no business deals disguised as vows. Just two people who had found each other in the darkness and chosen to walk into the light together. Grace wore a simple, white dress she had picked out herself, with wildflowers in her hair that Blake had collected from the fields surrounding the town. Blake wore a suit but no tie, his collar open, his smile genuine and unguarded. When the officiant asked if he took Grace to be his wife, Blake's voice was steady and sure. I do. Not because I have to, because I want to. Because she taught me that love isn't a transaction, it's a gift. And I choose to give her my heart every single day for the rest of my life. When it was Grace's turn, she looked at Blake with eyes that had learned to hope again. I do, because you didn't give up on us, even when I had. Because you showed me that broken things can be mended. Because loving you is the bravest and best thing I've ever done. They exchanged rings. Not expensive diamonds or designer bands, but simple gold circles they had chosen together at a small jewelry shop in town. Symbols of something unbreakable, something that would last. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Blake cupped Grace's face in his hands and kissed her softly, reverently, like she was the most precious thing in the world. Because to him, she was. Building a life worth living, they bought a house in Willowbrook. Not a mansion or a penthouse, just a comfortable 3-bedroom home with a front porch and a backyard where Grace could plant a garden. Blake learned to fix things with his hands, discovered he enjoyed physical work. The satisfaction of building something real, rather than just moving money around on screens. Grace opened an art studio downtown. It's offering classes for children and adults. She painted again, vibrant canvases full of color and hope, images of sunrise and new beginnings. Blake framed every single one and hung them throughout their home, replacing the sterile emptiness of his old life with warmth and beauty. They established a foundation in Oliver's name, providing financial assistance to families struggling with medical bills for childhood illnesses. Blake used his business acumen to grow the foundation into something substantial, something that helped hundreds of families avoid the impossible choices Grace had faced. It gave Oliver's life meaning beyond his death, gave his struggle purpose, gave Grace peace. Blake never returned to Montgomery Tech. He started a small software company in Willowbrook, employing local people, building something modest but meaningful. He worked reasonable hours, came home for dinner, spent his evenings with Grace rather than in boardrooms. He learned to value time over money, presence over profit, love over legacy. Grace taught him to cook, really cook. Not just heat up prepared meals, but create food from scratch. They spent Sunday mornings in their kitchen, flour on their clothes, music playing, laughing, when Blake inevitably burned something. Those simple moments, so ordinary and unremarkable, became Blake's favorite memories.